And we are live. Hello, everybody. Hi, Charlene. Hi, Dirty Basement Train. I see you there. How's everybody? So, with me today is an old friend of mine, Robert Brooks, traveling swordsman, martial art, historical European martial arts instructor, and author of At Your Mercy, the foundational guide to the Messer. How are you, Robert?
I'm very well, thank you. And coming to you from not my usual spot in northeast England on the coast of Northumberland, but I'm coming to you from a vineyard in Connecticut. I'm here in the US, promoting my book and teaching at a number of events. Just done a Messer workshop in the northeast here in Connecticut yesterday, and on Wednesday I fly into Las Vegas for Combat Con, which is the biggest HEMA event in the world. Yes.
Nice.
And I have a nice glass of red wine with me.
That always helps.
It's for everybody watching, it's 3 p.m. here, and it's 8 p.m. for you, Cole?
It's about 9 right now.
And about 9 p.m. Okay, so we're slightly different. It was 8 p.m. UK time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, before we start talking about Messers and fun medieval German stuff, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself? I know that you've been practicing for nearly 30 years now, yeah?
Yes. So the base for where I started with my love of history was growing up in Northumberland, which is the border county, the English border county with Scotland. And we have more castles in Northumberland per square mile than anywhere else in the world. Every village literally has a fortified building of some kind. And that's thanks to 400 years of continual border warfare. And being surrounded with history was always, it was an omnipresent factor in my life growing up. Naturally, I steered towards a path and a love of history. I began fencing in 1987, and it was at university, postgraduate in 1994 at Edinburgh, at Napier University, where I discovered a small group within the Napier University Fencing Club that was interested in looking at older methods of swordplay, and that was the beginning. And it ended up with the formation of the Dawn Duelist Society in Edinburgh, which is one of the first actual HEMA clubs in the world. And from there, I studied various different treatises and methodologies, bearing in mind that at this period there was no internet. And so when we were looking for treatises, we had a network on the kind of really early Google and Yahoo forums, where we would get entire manuscripts, often illegally photocopied. I mean, you think about now photocopying a 15th century manuscript.
Yeah, I don't think museums would like that very much.
Not a great idea. But it was the only way we'd get access to them, and so we'd wait patiently for the international mail to come, and you'd end up with an envelope this thick with the complete works of Joachim Meyer in it, and this was the way we accessed it. And so we didn't have the community at that time or the technology necessarily to freely share information very easily or very quickly. So I studied the sources, various different sources, until I found my niche, what I liked doing. And in 2003, I founded the Hotspur School of Defence, which we started off with 6 in rural northeast England. And as of today, we have somewhere in the region of 130, and we're training 4 nights a week with a second group training in a nearby town. So, and I gave up my career at the end of 2012, start of 2013. I was a journalist for 20 years, newspaper journalist, and I gave that up to become a full-time HEMA teacher. And that's really it. So next year, 2024 is my 30th anniversary in this field, and I feel quite privileged to still be here, not least because I'm still alive after all the accidents and injuries that I've had all over the years. But that I've seen this very, very small field, this very small field of interest grow into something way beyond I would ever have expected. Where at the beginning, maybe around the world in 1995, there were maybe a few hundred people. And at the best estimate now, there's somewhere maybe between 25 and 30,000 people
Yeah, at the very least, because no one is really
and
counting them.
and actively practicing these arts. So it's been a hell of a journey. And I actually had a conversation yesterday where I said it's really strange when I think that I have been doing HEMA now longer than I knew my parents.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah. Yeah, my parents passed away when I was in my early 20s, and so technically now I have been doing HEMA longer than I knew my parents.
Whoa, all right.
So a long time.
Yeah, that kind of puts it into a very different
It
perspective.
does put it into perspective. Yeah.
Okay, so hi Cross, I see you there. Just 1 second, because my camera seems to have decided to freeze itself.
The joys of modern technology.
Oh yeah, it doesn't like to work in this kind of weather. So, in the meantime, while I patch this up, would you like to tell us a bit about where would you like to start? Would you like to start talking about the Messier? Would you like to start talking about German fencing schools? Because I know they're both subjects that you have studied very deeply.
Yeah. So for me, my interest in medieval swordsmanship began with Joachim Meyer around about 1997, 98, where we had the first hard copy facsimile, and I mean that facsimile in the literal sense that this was a photocopy of Meyer's Kunst des Fechtens, the art of fencing from 1570. And Meyer's work is a landmark. It's not only an incredibly beautiful document with lavish illustration, but it is incredibly descriptive. And so Meyer's work paved the way really for a fascination with German fencing from the earliest period or among the earliest periods that we could study. And of course, it emerged that there were, in fact, earlier manuscripts going back to potentially as far back as 1389 within the Lichtnauer tradition. And Meyer's work really deals with this one particular tradition, although I will caveat that Meyer in 1570 is becoming heavily influenced by the burgeoning Renaissance that has spread from Italy to elsewhere in Europe. And so we start to see Italian fencing norms beginning to creep into what we could consider to be a German tradition. But the Lichtnauer tradition itself is fascinating to me because the earliest record, as I mentioned, we have potentially an early date of 1389. It may be later than that. The manuscript date is in some doubt. This is a manuscript called MS 3227A. Often referred to as the Dobringer Fecht book because it contains the work of a fencing master called Henko Dobringer. But Dobringer is only one part of this manuscript, so it's been referred to as the Paul House book because it belonged to a fencer a person called Nicholas Paul. And this is really the earliest record. And from that early date, we then find a number of manuscripts that cover the Lichtnauer tradition quite heavily before Meyer even touches it. And the key one of these really is a manuscript attributed to Peter von Danzig, or Peter of Gdansk, who was named as a master of the Lichtnauer Fellowship. And this manuscript dates from 1452. And the beauty of von Danzig's manuscript is it contains not just the original Lichtnauer verse, but also a gloss of interpretation. So it's a very rich manuscript. And that's really where I began, was with the longsword, with the German longsword. I was also heavily studying Italian longsword at the same time. So the works of Fiore de Liberi and Filippo Vardi, the Pisan fencing master. But this entryway into the German fencing led to other avenues, and one of those was Messer. And strangely, Meyer's manuscript of 1570 contains the Dusak. And the Dusak and the Mesa are almost interchangeable. Single-handed, single-edged cutting sword. The Dusak being the live Dusak, the weapon, the Dusak being a Bohemian, southern Hungarian single-edged cutting sword that possibly dates even to the 14th century. But the path with Mesa crosses. And of course, by Meyer's time, the Dusak is ostensibly a training weapon used to train in all single-edged cutting swords. But the Mesa in its own right has a very rich history, and the most common manuscript, everybody's favorite, Hans Talhofer. Everybody knows Hans Talhofer. Hans Talhofer's manuscript contains a lot of Mesa plays, but not a great deal of description. And I began to look at Mesa in real detail in about 2010.
Let me just bring this up because people will want to know what a Mesa looks like. This is a plastic one, but it should give the general idea.
So the Mesa, the name Mesa in German simply means knife. And langes Messer, long knife. You sometimes get Kriegsmesser, war knife. You also sometimes get Großmesser, or large knife. And what differentiates the Messer from other sword-like objects is that it is very distinct in the hilt. It has a knife style of construction, and it has an extrusion on the cross, a third axis of defense, which is known as the Nagel in German, sometimes Wehrnagel, which is literally a nail or a defense nail. And this is a really important step in the evolution of European swords. And the Mesa, for me, fascinated me because the Mesa is the weapon of the peasant. It's the weapon of the common man. This isn't a knightly weapon. It's not a weapon for warfare. There are other better weapons for use in warfare. The Mesa is the everyman weapon. This is what most men in ordinary society will be armed with or carry on a regular basis, whether you're traveling between towns or you're in the fields or you're in the forest. Always good to have a handy long knife for various different jobs or for protecting yourself against the likes of bears, wolves, bandits, etc. And we see the Mesa go through a really interesting change in the 15th century because these long knives seem to exist in the century before. Although they tend to come in shorter, ever-increasing lengths. And the first examples we begin to see are what are referred to as Bauernwehr, Bauer being the German word for farmer or peasant, and Wehr being defense. So these are farmers or peasants' defenses. And these knives are utilitarian. They will wear them in everyday dress, almost as common as you see a dagger being worn.
All right.
This is a tool.
Okay.
And
Bob, could you excuse me? We have a question here. How is the extra piece on the hilt used? And I had another question for you after that.
Okay. So in terms of its use, sorry.
Yeah. How is the nagel used? I think is the question.
So the nagel is a really interesting feature. I mean, if you want to show the hilt up close so that the nagel can be seen,
yeah.
If you show the hilt of the
one sec. Sorry, can I unfreeze the camera again? Sorry about this.
Sorry. If you can show the hilt of the Mesa so that the nagel is clear, if you have your Mesa with you.
Yes, 1 second because I need to unfreeze the other camera again. So, okay. One sec, please.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm still frozen or visible from there, but
yeah, I can see you. That's fine. So you can see this extrusion that projects across the back of the hand. And this nagel, if we think from a very simplistic viewpoint that if we're a peasant and we're fighting or using a weapon, we're not wearing any protection. We're not wearing any gauntlets. We're not dressed in any kind of armor. And the nagel is simply an extension of the hilt to protect the hand. And in fact, this is the first evidence we see of a complex hilt in European swords. Where we see European swords develop from here, we see, for example, rings begin to replace the nagel. We also see knuckle bows, which come down over the front of the hand. And eventually we see dishes and clamshells, and eventually fully enclosed hilts. And these generally will denote a weapon that is designed for fighting out of armor. You're not going to be wearing any protection when you're using this weapon. All you have to rely on is the weapon itself and your own ability.
So literally, this stops you from having your fingers sliced off.
Yes, so the nagel will prevent a blow traveling down the flat of the blade into the hand. And the nagel is used quite heavily. So we see the hand being turned there where Carl is holding the weapon to the outside. So this is the nagel is covering the outside of the body. If he turns it the opposite way, kind of here, you can see that the nagel here will cover the inside of the body and the inside of the hand. And so this is a genius addition to a single-handed, fairly short cutting sword. Yes, it can thrust, but it's predominantly a weapon for cutting. And so this nagel will protect the hand when you're not wearing any kind of protection. We have no benefit of an armored gauntlet or even a reinforced leather glove. This is a bare hand weapon.
Okay, and I had another question for you. I remember when I took your class last November, you were mentioning that the strategies of using the messer, if you were a peasant, had to be slightly different than, go in and chop off their face or whatever.
Very much. And in fact, Messer has completely changed the way I approached all of my medieval historical fencing, because one of the ways I interpret a manuscript, and as a historian, it's important just to not ask the question, what is it? And for example, if it's a methodology, what is it and how do we do it? But why is it written this way? Why is it arranged this way? Why is the manuscript set out in this way? Why is it describing the things it's describing and not other things? And the Messer is very, very good for giving you an insight into this. And so when we think about fighting and we think about interpersonal violence in a social context, today, if you get into a street fight and the police come along, the chances are you're going to be arrested and you'll end up before magistrates, possibly charged with assault, and you're going to have to defend yourself. You're going to have to justify your actions. Now, we have the benefit today of self-defense. We can use, in the UK, for example, if I'm assaulted or I fear assault, I can use reasonable force to prevent an assault. Reasonable force. And this is the maxim. What we see in 15th century German society, and by German, I'm not talking about a nation, but a people, and a people who exist within the context of the Holy Roman Empire. Germany at this point is a series of separate principalities, duchies, and feudal fiefdoms that exist kind of in this a series of alliances and rivalries. There's no German nation at this point. And when you begin to look at civic law in this period, and this is why context is very important to historical fencing. Historical fencing is a product of the environment or the society that it was created in. What we find is that when it comes to the lower classes in society, so anybody who is not of aristocratic birth is a commoner. To an extent, this is still the case in the United Kingdom. If you are royalty or aristocracy, you are royalty and aristocracy. Anywhere below that, you are an ordinary person. And we still have in the UK the House of Commons and the Houses of Lords. The House of Lords. And so we still have this differentiation in the UK. Now, this is symptomatic of European society generally. And what we find is that in German civic society of the 15th century, there are certain things that the greater powers, the authorities who rule, let the peasants get on with. They can deal with this. In essence, we don't want to waste time dealing with this trivial stuff that these farmers and market stallholders and fishmongers and butchers and fur makers deal with. That's the little people. We don't want to deal with that kind of stuff. However, when it gets to a certain point, the authorities, the higher authorities, become involved. And where this breaks down is, and it's very simple, killing people today is viewed as quite an extreme act. Surprise, surprise, killing people in the 15th century is viewed as quite an extreme act. And so human beings have not changed very much in their attitudes towards murder. And this is evident from the sources. Is medieval society more violent than modern society? Arguably, yes. In some respects, arguably no in others. And it's in terms of escalation and lethality. And what we find in the documentary evidence from 15th century German civic society is that there is an unspoken acceptance that a certain degree of violence is fine if it means that the peasants can sort their stuff out without attracting the attentions of the authorities. And the authorities have bigger, more important things to do in their minds. And so this idea that Jan and Hans can fight as long as nobody is killed or injured to such an extent. Because you imagine the situation, you have a common man who has trained for 10 years to become an expert leather worker. And this expert leather worker makes saddles for the local nobleman. And he's killed in a fight, in a street fight over some trivial matter. The nobleman will be damn sure to be wondering who killed his master craftsman, because now he's going to go and have to find somebody else to make his saddles. And so this is an inconvenience, and they don't like inconvenience. They like things to run smoothly. Also, this expert craftsman was providing a lot of tax to me. He was paying a lot of tax. I don't like this. I don't like the fact that also, and on a more pragmatic level, peasants killing peasants generally leads to disorder. Other people get pulled in, and before you know it, you've got conflagrations where whole communities are fighting each other. They don't want unrest within their areas. Unrest quickly grows out of control. You then have to quell unrest, and then other people bring their grievances into unrest. And so this is a way of managing the population. Let the population deal with their problems with a certain degree of violence. And Mesa is full of this. It's full of this. When we see, for example, let's take a simple action. Imagine ourselves in a tournament setting today. Yeah. 5 points for this top triangle. Let's ask ourselves what that translates to in real life. 5 points in that tournament means striking the head or thrusting the face. What happens in reality if we do that?
Someone ends up
somebody's dead. And so what we find in the Mesa is that, yes, we see these things being taught, but the first play of a manuscript that dates somewhere around about the 1430s, which is known as the Glasgow manuscript, gives us a very good example of this. And this is why I named my book the way I did. It says, if he strikes at you or thrusts at you, you make the simple displacement in which your blade stands upright or your edge stands above, and you displace and you spring out hard to his right side in the triangle, and you hit him where you will, for he is at your mercy. What it doesn't say is kill him. It doesn't say strike him through the neck. It doesn't say stab him in the face. It says this is a judgment call. This is a judgment call. And what we find in Mesa is that Mesa before Johannes Lekushna, and I'll come to Johannes Lekushna. Mesa before Johannes Lekushna, before 1478, Lekushna is a master of Mesofancy. He writes a manuscript in 1478. Before 1478, if you look at the Mesa fencing manuscripts, there is very little fencing. Very little fencing. We're not going to see all these fancy players around the blade and lots of flourishing and multiple strikes and parries. When you don't see this. What you see is the Mesa being used as a force equalizer My opponent may be bigger or stronger or more aggressive than me, but I have a messer. If I put this edge on him, I will cut him. If I strike him in the wrist, it will end a fight. If I wrap my pommel around his wrist and pull hard, I can get in close and I can grapple. And this is the epitome of messer. Messer is about, or early messer is about resolving civil disputes in a less than lethal fashion. Now, does this mean that messer was never used in a lethal fashion? No, because there are caveats. And the caveats generally apply to thrusting. Thrusts by their nature are deadly. The moment somebody thrusts at you, you have recourse to end them because their intention is clear. They wish to end your life. Give you the difference between a cut and a thrust. You can sustain 10, 15, 20 cuts to the body and still live and recover. And as long as they're not cutting tendons or major blood vessels, you're going to be okay. You're going to be covered in scars, but you're going to be okay. One good thrust to the abdomen, the neck, the face, or if it penetrates the chest cavity, is going to kill you. It's going to kill you dead. If you don't die instantaneously or die within a few minutes, you're going to contract some horrible, horrible infection, and it's going to end your life in 5 to 7 days. And the last 2 days, believe me, are not going to be pleasant. And we see even in the fight manuscripts, and Maya himself, he says, words to the effect that thrusts are the preserve of murderers and robbers. That thrusts are viewed as being despicable. You thrust at somebody, and we see this also in contemporary accounts. There are many, many accounts where people die by stabbing, and the perpetrator is dealt with in the most severe terms. In some cases, is killed on the spot.
In fact,
in one case we see hangs himself after escaping through shame.
Oh, well.
And so this idea of stabbing the human body in a civilian context. Now, remember, we're not talking about warfare or a judicial duel. We're talking about a street fight. Stabbing somebody is viewed as being the lowest of the low. This is the worst thing you can do to somebody because there's a very good chance you're going to kill them. Now, couple that with a highly religious mindset. If you murder, you're going to burn for eternity. Okay. And remember that people in this period are very, very religious. Some people might pay lip service, but generally the supernatural belief is very strong. And so the system of messer that we see, while it can be lethal, is by its nature designed to resolve disputes between the lower classes in a often bloody, but non-lethal way. And there's a beautiful street sign in the city of Antwerp in the Netherlands. And it reads, it's a marketplace, and the sign reads, it's one of those, there's historic markers, which tells you what used to happen in that particular place. And this sign reads, here, the members of the Butchers' Guild would gather and settle their disputes with their long knives.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And so this is a method of, if I can use this messer well, I am as good as any man. I'm as good as any man. If you're bigger and stronger than me, I don't care. I'm going to cut you. And it reminds me of this wonderful woodcut by a German artist called Hans Sebald Beham. And he draws this woodcut in the 16th century. And the text on it shows a peasant brawl. And this peasant brawl is a hell of a brawl. There's messers in it. There's long swords in it. There's pitchforks and even a spear.
I don't know if you.
And it is in the book. It's in the book. I use it in the book because it's so important. And the text on this image says in German, so stich ich dich, haust du mich, so stich ich dich. If you cut at me, I'm gonna stab you.
Okay, so let's see if I can.
And that's the image there. That's the image from Hans Sebald Beham. And this is the archetypal peasant brawl. And this has escalated to a point where people are actively trying to stab each other, which is generally the most serious kind of fight you can bear. But what we see in the messer methodology, and this can be from the earliest right the way through to even the likes of Le Kushner, 1478, through to Peter Faulkner, 1494, and continuing through. This is a weapon that can kill. but the choice is yours. And so we're going to train you to be able to control the outcome of this fight to your desire. And desire is a really, really important thing. We see this word crop up repeatedly in not just German, but Italian fencing manuscripts. That Fiore's, so for example, Fiore. Let's look at Fiore's dagger as a proofing of this Mesa theory. Fiore's dagger, 76 plays of the dagger. Now, the dagger has one purpose. If that foot-long piece of steel in an ice pick penetrates your clavicle or your face or your neck, you're dead. You're dead. You're dying. So, the first play of the dagger is he's stabbing at your head or your neck or your clavicle with a dagger. What's your first action against him? Disarm him. My logic would say, he's intending to kill me. I have a dagger. Is stop him and stab him through the face so they can no longer stab at me. But Fiore doesn't do that. Fiore says the first play he shows is the posta longa, wrap the arm in what the position he calls the dente digitale or the boar's tooth, and you disarm him with this turn, yeah? Now, that seems to be a fairly mild resolution to a very, very dangerous situation. And I would add to that, in Fiore's dagger section, 76 plays of the dagger spread across 9 situational masters. How many times do you see somebody being stabbed? Nil, none. But yet in every example where he tells you what's possible, he says, I will hold you in this lock and I will not let you go. You will not escape unless I allow you. Or I will break your arm. But you do not, he says, I can stab you if I desire to do this, if I wish to do this. But in no circumstances he's saying, and the next, so you disarm him and then you stab him in the face. It doesn't say that. And so what we're seeing in this, when we look at it in this way, is we're seeing that the instruction of the period is giving you a choice. It's not saying 5 points is the optimum outcome. The optimum outcome is not to kill unless absolutely unavoidable. And when we look at the world in which they live, and also today the world in which we live, there are only 2 that I can find, 2 legitimate arenas in which we can kill: warfare, or with the authority of a higher power, i.e., judicially. And this is the 15th century model. You can get permission to fight a judicial duel. We see this in Hans Stahlhofer and various other manuscripts, Paulus Karl. Or you can kill in warfare. You've been given sanction to kill. But beyond that, killing is extreme. If you can avoid it, you avoid it. And there's pragmatic reasons also. You kill somebody who's important, you're going to have all their people coming after you. You kill somebody with a big badass family, all his big badass family are coming after you. And we see, from where I am in the northeast of England, many of your viewers might have heard of the Border Reivers, essentially families which were their own private armies. And they were renowned for their interfamilial warfare. And you get this word, feuds that happen. Blood feuds. Somebody kills somebody, and then it becomes revenge. We need to kill one of theirs. They kill one of yours. I kill 10 of theirs. I've killed 10 of theirs. They killed 20 of mine. And this thing goes out of control really, really quickly. And so this is a means of retaining some degree of control over society. When you haven't got an active police force, you don't even have an active standing army. And the power of the Lord really exists in the people he can control to exercise his will. And if you've got everybody fighting everybody, well, the German alle gegen alle, everyone against everybody, the whole thing becomes unmanageable. It becomes a mess. It's chaos. And societies do not like chaos. And they rule this. This is the way they rule it. So we see if you're in a fight and somebody's injured and there's a complaint, but it's non-lethal, the chances are you'll end up in German civic society in the 15th century in front of the Wehrmacht court. And the Wehrmacht court is corrupt as hell.
Okay.
Whoever's got sway and got power and authority will probably come out best in that. The minute you kill somebody, you are really on very, very, very dangerous territory. very dangerous territory. But we also see cases in which there are accidental deaths, and the killer is given the benefit of the doubt and said, yeah, this wasn't intentional, but they're still ordered, for example, to pay the victim's family, he was a craftsman of some repute, a stipend for the next 10 years, which would have been the run-off to his retirement. You've got to pay his wages. He's gone, you pay his family his wages for the next 10 years. If you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. And so they have a way of managing this. And so from this social history, we see this reflected in the fight book. And this, for me, is a really important part of the fight book, because the fight book is not just telling us what to do and how to do it. It is telling us a story of the culture it exists in. And this is why we cannot dispense with the H in HEMA. Mm-hmm. We need to understand the history. Otherwise, it becomes Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. And everybody's riding around the countryside murdering each other because you can do that. Could you imagine living in a society like that? They didn't.
Yeah, it sounds more like Conan the Barbarian than the Middle Ages. Yeah.
So imagine living in a society like that. They didn't live in a society like that. Yes, violence was more prevalent, but violence was managed. And it was managed within acceptable parameters within society. You give him 5 or 6 cuts to the face, he's gonna have some scars. He's gonna remember the encounter. It's gonna serve as a lesson. He's not gonna pick fights anymore. The moment you kill somebody, all bets are off. You can be killed, not just by the the minute you kill somebody, you can be killed. If it's a mass brawl, yeah, you can be killed, and it's justified. Well, he murdered somebody, so I killed him before he killed me. Or you can be killed by the authorities. And so we see this repeated through the record. My argument from a HEMA perspective is, if we understand that killing is not the default option, we are forced to fence better.
True story, yeah.
Because not if you imagine it in terms of movement, let's just break this down to movement. Every able-bodied human being is able to make powerful gross motor movements, and the most simple of which is you get something harder than the human body in the right hand, you're right-handed, you lift it above your head, and you do this action.
Beating like a witless ox, so to speak.
Beating like a witless ox. They warn about this. They say not to do this, but because anybody can do this. I use this analogy. I love analogies because they're funny and they make people think about. Let's imagine a Wild West scenario. Let's imagine a Wild West saloon in Tombstone, Arizona, 1850. Texas Pete is sitting at the bar. Texas Pete had a run-in with Cactus Jack a few days ago. And Pete's sitting at the bar drinking his whiskey. And Cactus Jack comes in through the saloon doors and he's not seen. And he sees Pete and he thinks, okay, you son of a bitch, I'm gonna sort this out now. Picks up a bar stool and smashes him over the back with it. How many bar stool fighting lessons did he attend to learn that skill? He didn't, because it's a gross motor movement that all humans can make. Controlling the outcome of a fight requires training. This is why we see these trained responses. They are training so that you have a choice that fits with your moral judgment. And we can't separate this from the fight books. This is inseparable. They give you these techniques, not just to, I don't know how you feel about bad language on your podcast. They're not giving you the option to fuck the other guy up. They're giving you the option to come out of it with your neck not in a rope. And it's that straightforward. But to get to that point, the easiest option is smash him through the head repeatedly until he's not moving. Disarming him while he's threatening to cut you is much more difficult. That's why we need to train. We need to train so that we can resolve these confrontations. And remember that these are extremely violent situations where we need to train a measured, controlled response when the adrenaline is pumping, when the fear is there. And so we replace base instinct, we replace natural reaction with trained, controlled response. And that's the key. That's why these manuscripts are the way they are. And so this is really the reason why I wrote the Mesa book, is to make people, it's to encourage people to think about the way they fence. Is it a murder fest, or is there something actually at stake here? And if you went into a fencing tournament and think, if I kill the other guy, I'm going to hang. Now, saying that, let's think of a 15th century fencing tournament.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about it because you've printed the ordinances of Prague in your book, and they're absolutely fascinating. There are a couple of them that I want to ask you about later, but please go on.
So the fechtschule, the fencing school, is not what we think as being a fencing school. The fechtschule is a place where men who have trained get together and fight. And they fight within a rigid set of rules that's required for keeping people safe, but they're fencing with blunt steel, and no protection. So my first observation would be either they're fencing with a lot of control and self-restraint, or there are a lot of badly injured and dead people at the end of these gatherings. And these gatherings happen in every town, every city across the German Holy Roman Empire for centuries. Do people get killed? Yes, occasionally. Things happen. As I say, shit happens. Somebody loses control of a bout or gets angry, yes. But if we look at the organization of a fechtschule, and there's a beautiful list of fechtschule rules from 1597 from Prague, they tell us how we organize, who organizes, who adjudicates, who can fence, how the fencers must behave, the penalties for misbehavior.
Actually, I had a question about that because it seems that even if there are fight schools, the people tasked with organizing the bouts, the tournaments, are the knife makers guilds.
Yes, the knife makers guild, and they must
What's
have.
the reasoning behind it?
So the knife makers guild really are, again, the best we can assess from this is that the knife makers guild are generally people in good standing. They belong to a guild. They've got a reputation to uphold. Guilds, by their nature in this period, value good behavior. You're an upstanding citizen, therefore you're worthy of joining our guild. This is a gentrification process we see in society. I want to be a member of the guild, so I'm seen as an upstanding citizen, and therefore people think I'm a good guy and they buy my stuff. Yeah. But also, the notable in that list of fechtschule ordinances, that the people adjudicating the fechtschule must be burghers from the old town. They must be people in a position of common authority. So city burghers, commoners with some degree of authority from above. Now, let's remember that the burghers of this time have the ability to adjudicate over common affairs and not only impose sanctions, but have the power to imprison. And funnily enough, in the fechtschule rules, we see that the penalties for severe disruption in the fechtschule include imprisonment. Now, you imagine going along to your tournament, say you go to IGX or you go to, any big tournament that you go to in whichever country you're in, and you know that if you fence like an asshole, they're going to put you in prison for 3 days.
Okay, may I read this section from your book because it's just
sure.
one of the fantastic ones. It's like, okay, in folio 92 he notes that one should, quote, secretly appoint some men who have a hidden bag with them at the swordsmanship competitions and stand behind the people. Then grab him as it is depicted before, and as you have brought him in the scale, lead him with force to these who stands with the bag, and make him crawl to it.
Yes. So Lekushna in 1478 gives in 1482 he writes a second version of his manuscript, gives a direct instruction of how to eject an asshole from a fencing tournament. And that involves throwing him upside down into a bag held by two of your friends. And when he's in the bag, your friends take him away and beat him. So this is, if we had rules like this in our current fencing tournaments, they would be a lot better. I'm an advocate of beating people in sacks. But the one I really like is, I like the Rule 34 from the Prague Ordinances.
Okay. Shall I go ahead and read it?
Yeah, Rule 34 from the Prague Ordinance.
Okay. Sorry. Quote, a column should be pitched close to the fence, and a small shovel hung on it. If anyone enters the fence without authorization or behaves badly, he will endure beating with that shovel 3 times. Anyone chosen by the elders or the tournament organizer to proceed with the beating must oblige.
Yeah. So hang a small shovel. A shovel. Have you seen it? Carl, have you seen these tactical shovels that they
Yeah.
issue to the military? Yeah. So you imagine a shovel, a small spade, yeah, that you can, you use to dig coal or whatever. You hang the small shovel on a post at the edge of the fencing area, and anybody behaving like a dick, you order them to be beaten with it. So shovel beatings are a thing, and what I like about this, I mean, the rules themselves are very, very self-evident, but the penalties are very clear. If you
Yeah.
behave in a certain way, that you are not gentrifying the gathering, if you're not behaving, and this is something peculiar that happens in the 15th century, from about 1450 onwards, we have this transition from the bower, the peasant farmer, to, because of urbanization and the craftsmen, the craftspeople, the people who have negotiable skills, begin to generate money and position within their society, the emergence of the middle class. And with the emergence of the middle class, there becomes this desire to emulate the higher ups. They emulate the practices of the aristocrats. Even though they're still common people and they're bound by their commonality through things like sumptuary laws, they cannot wear certain furs, they cannot dress in certain, they can't use certain colors, they can't even wear shoes with a certain length of point. But they can work within the framework of what they have. And so what we see from the kind of 1440s, 1450s onwards is the emergence of this middle class who begin to gentrify themselves. I almost think like you take the crummiest, run-down rural town you've ever been in, and you build a Whole Foods there. Yeah? It's gentrification. They're saying, we need to socially better ourselves because we have money now. We have money and we have status and we can do these things, and we're no longer grubbing around in the dirt. Remember that serfdom and feudalism generally is finished at this point. People have a good degree of freedom where they can do certain things. You still have obligations. And this is where Lekushna comes in. Lekushna is a vicar. He's a well-educated man. He serves various stipends around the Nuremberg area. He's also up at the Leipzig. But he's generally from that Nuremberg, Augsburg kind of southern part of Germany. And Lekushna is also a messer fencer.
Okay.
And so you have a vicar, a priest, who fences with messer. And this is very much a status symbol. He goes out and he will fence with this messer. And Lekushna in 1478 does something that has not been done before with messer, and in fact hasn't been done before with any weapon. He takes an existing methodology, Lichtenauer's longsword, and shoehorns messer into it.
Right.
And he takes all of his knowledge and he fills Lichtenauer's model with messer. So where in Lichtenauer you have the Vierleger, the four guards of the longsword, the Alba, the lower guard, the Flug, the middle guard, the Ochs, the kind of upper guards on either side, and the Vom Tag above the head. Lekushna has Bastei, Eber, Stier, Lugensland, and he even takes Lichtenauer's guards, and then he takes Lichtenauer's special strikes and applies them to the messer, but he adds one of his own. And what Lekushna is doing is gentrifying the messer for a now emerging literate class of people to fence with. Because the first part of Lekushna's manuscript with the messer is something we do not see beforehand, fencing with the messer. Not the peasantry shit where they're running in and grappling each other and wrenching each other's wrists and slicing their necks as they're getting close. That goes to the back part of his manuscript. That's the street messer. This is the messer, the common messer. But the beginning part is how to fence with the messer. And this arguably is the gentrification. This is the Mesa becoming a weapon of not just a pragmatic weapon for civilian defense, but an expressive weapon of one's dexterity and skill and courage and culture. And it's a culture thing. Now, again, when I wrote the book, I find there is a dividing line. There's a very clear dividing line, and it's over the period of 8 years. In 1470, Paulus Karl, the great Bavarian fencing master, writes his manuscript, and Karl is a member of the Lichtnauer Fellowship. And he has Messe in there. Now, we think Lichtnauer is mainly to do with the knightly arts, the ritterliche Kunst, or the knightly arts of fencing. So why does he include Messe? Well, because most of your population is armed with one. But Karl only shows half a dozen plays of the Messe. It's enough. It's enough. This is what peasants do. 8 years later, Lekushna writes the Kunst des Messerfechtens, the art of Messerfencing, with 400 pages of Messerfencing. It's the biggest single weapon treatise ever written, bigger than anything. If you were to take all the longsword material from all the manuscripts written in that period, Lekushna's Kunst des Messerfechtens is larger than all of them combined. And this is a peasant weapon. So the peasants have the power, the real power. There are more of them. There are more of them doing the system, and it's an incredibly sophisticated system of fencing, which is why I love it. The most simple people in society have this incredibly complex, rich, functional fighting art, and it's built around wrestling. But by 1478, the wrestling kind of becomes, well, that's what the peasants do. But we're now not peasants, we're middle class. And so we want to fence with it, like the aristocrats do.
Floor kind of thing.
Yeah, we want to fence with it. And lo and behold, this is what happens. And we see this change, this dramatic change within the period of about 8 years. That this is peasant stuff. Oh, this is no longer peasant stuff. This is way beyond that. It's way beyond. Almost like if you look at Egyptian history, you have desert, and then suddenly you have pyramids. It's one extreme to the other. There's nothing, and then there's a pyramid. The biggest man-made structure before they built St. Paul's Cathedral in London in the 17th century. This is a sea change, a seismic change in martial culture. But we also have the necessity for the ordinary man to practice arms, because you may be no standing armies, you may be called up in defense, you may be called up as militia, just for some civic duties. You may be called up in the defense of your region or your lord, or you even, in some cases, we see nation states at that time, like England, you might be called up to fight in a campaign. Now, the Occam's razor says, I would rather know how to use a weapon than suddenly get my draft paper and say, by the way, we need you to be ready for disembarkation to fight a campaign in France in 2 weeks. Yeah. And I'm thinking, I've never picked up anything other than a pitchfork. Shit. What am I going to do? So the practice of arms is part of a man's education, very much a part. But wrestling is already a very ancient folk sport, a very ancient physical sport. And so Messe lends itself very, very well to the already existing physical culture of the period. And so, but what we see in the second half of the 15th century is suddenly Messe becomes gentrified, becomes very different. And the strangest thing of all is, after Lekushna, every major source that deals with Messe is a version of Lekushna.
Okay.
It doesn't go back to the peasant material. It's just a version of Lekushna. Now, I mentioned Meyer at the very beginning. Meyer takes Lekushna and plagiarizes him. Naughty Meyer. And I'm going to offend some Meyerists by saying this. But he takes Lekushna's model and Meyer applies it to the transitional rapier, what they call the rapier, or the side sword. And so Meyer's side sword is Lekushna's Messe. And so what we're seeing is actually the Messe beginning in its humble peasant place as a kind of a utilitarian sidearm that you get in close and you equalize forces and you can slice and do various things with, to becoming a fencing sword, by the end of the 15th century and by the last quarter of the 16th century, forming the basis for Maya's Arabia. And so this is now becoming a full sweep, the Mesa's evolution in one movement. But to finish the Mesa story, where it is really interesting, is the Mesa exists in its exact form right up until the end of the 19th century.
Oh, that's late?
Yes.
All right.
Anything that can be described as a hanger or hunting hanger, even arguably swords like spadroons, are little more than modified mesas. So when you see your hunting hanger from the 18th century, which has generally got a stirrup hilt and a single edge, sometimes you've got a saw back. You take it hunting, you can saw through bones with it. You can use it to butcher a wild boar in the field or a deer. Yeah, it's a mesa. And so the mesa exists in its form from the Bauernwehr of the 14th century is right the way through the 19th century, unchanged. And the remarkable thing is it still fulfills its original purpose. This is a civilian tool that you use in the field to do all of your jobs that you need a bloody big knife for, whether that's butchering a carcass in the wild, or doing whatever you need to do with this hunting hanger type weapon. And so the mesa is arguably, I would say, but I'm prejudiced, the mesa is the most important sword in European history.
Okay, that's a pretty big claim, but
it is a pretty big claim, but actually I'll caveat that. The mesa is the most important sword in Western European history.
okay.
Saber definitely is the most important weapon in European history.
All
But the
right.
saber is simply a derivation of the mesa. It's a single-edged cutting sword with a hand protection.
All
So
right.
the saber is arguably just a big, curvy mesa. And so these things tend to follow, everybody is we're often so determined to follow the Victorian model of categorizing everything, like Linnaeus. We'll categorize everything. We need to have a Latin name for this and categorize it into it. And this is a different species of that one particular beetle. And we found 25 different variants of this beetle. So let's give it a different name. And we're still doing this. And this idea of categorization, this specialization, really often doesn't fit reality.
Yeah,
Because
it's a sword.
even when
What's this? Also a sword.
even when we look at mesas of the period, the few that survive, they're all different. They all are built for the hand of the person who commissioned them. I like shorter mesas. I like a mesa with a blade of about 34 inches. Some people, and I like my mesas wide and short. Some people like long, thin mesas. Yeah, it's a personal choice. There's no standardization. You haven't got factories churning out patterns of weapons. They go, bladesmith, I'm going to turn out 25 curvy ones. Yes, Fritz likes the curvy mesa. Yeah, he's asked for a curvy blade, and so this is it. So it's a very personal thing. But the mesa single-edged, single-handed, largely cutting weapon with some degree of hand protection built in. Whether it's just a noggle or a knuckle bow, as we see, or even a closed stirrup that we see in the hangers of the 18th and 19th centuries, they're all messes.
Okay,
They're all big knives.
I see that in the chat, Tertman is talking about Mensur. I believe that's a different tradition kind of thing, yeah? I mean, the academic fencing where you were not supposed to move your feet or anything, yeah?
The mensur, yes. Yeah. Saber fencing. Possibly a relation, but the argument that, I also have, apart from the Hotspur School of Defence, I have a separate school called the Husaria Guild of Saber Fencing, where we teach mid-19th century Imperial German fencing, and saber fencing. And the lineage for that seems to be born out of Arabia. So yeah, it's quite unusual. But saber, a single-edged cutting sword, you can apply pretty much. My maxim is, you can pretty much apply anything with a messer to any single-edged cutting sword. And in fact, we can go further than that. In the Glasgow manuscript, we see in the first instruction, he says, the advice is to hold your sword at your hip. And he says, and the text reads, Halt dein Schwert, sword, crossed out in red ink, Messer, written above. So even there, they're not differentiating between the word, or the scribes certainly didn't differentiate between the word Schwert and Messer. They're often interchangeable. And I'm often asked the question about falchions. Falchions or falchions messers. Falchions are single-edged swords. They have a tang and generally a pommel. So they're a sword messer. They're a different hilt construction. Falchions really don't have a name in that period. There is this idea that they were called in German Malkus, but we find no documentary evidence that these are actually, they're just referred to simply as Schwert.
So where did the
Swords.
name come from? Or when did the name come from? The name, where did the name falchion come from?
So falchion is they're from the Latinization falcata.
No, I mean like, did someone slap the name on them in the 1800s or something like that?
So yeah, 1900. Generally the sort of the period, the great revisionist period of history, so the 19th century, where we're really academically beginning to try and understand our past, and so this idea of categorization. So the falchion is a derivation of from falx. So you have the Dacian falx, the falcata. So these curved bladed single-handed swords, generally with a single edge. Although the falx has its cutting edge on the inside of the curve. So
pretty much a large
yeah. So yeah, the messer for me is really been a game changer in terms of understanding the context of HEMA in terms of the society that it was written as part of. Everybody has a different idea or even a different objective of what they want to achieve in the study of swordsmanship. Some people do it for fun. Some people love the history. If you're studying the manuscripts, or if you're claiming to study the manuscripts, then the most important advice I can give you is learn the context, learn about society of this period, because it will change your view. It will change your view of the people of the time, and it'll change the way you fence. And that your fencing will no longer be the race to the first head strike.
Yeah.
Yeah. It will be, how do I want this fight to turn out? We often at my school, we play a game where we each fencer is given a card, and on that card is written the outcome.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So in this fight, you are permitted to murder your opponent. In this fight, you must restrain your opponent. And so, two different objectives. It's really interesting when both people draw the murder card, because then you've got what we see in generally a tournament. But when both fencers draw the restraint card, they then have to think about how they're going to approach this fight. How am I going to approach this? And you can imagine that in real life. You can imagine fighting somebody you do not want to fight. Some drunk nobleman who, if you kill him, you are going to be in the shit. Come along, my lord, as you're wrenching his shoulder and leading him out of the tavern. Yeah. And again, we've got to put, and the thing is, this doesn't have to be a dry historical or dry exercise in historical realism. This can be fun. Give yourself fencing exercises where you create the environment as if it's, you create a scenario, much like a role-playing game. You're walking through the forest, and all of a sudden this guy appears and asks you for your money. Let's work out let's see how this works out. And this is why I approached the workshop I've just done in the context of this woodcut of a peasant's brawl, because I always thought, how did that work out? You've got some guy on with a spear there. That's not a good finish. If he sticks that in somebody, That's problematic. So how does the guy with the messer deal with that guy with the spear? And so asking these questions can lead to a lot of fun, because
Yeah, I can imagine.
we ended the workshop yesterday with a mass peasant brawl.
Oh, tell me you took a video with it.
Yes, we did.
Yes!
15 people each side, armed with long swords, messers, and spears, and rondel daggers. And do you know the weirdest thing? Because we've been teaching the messer use against the other weapons, as well as the messer, on 2 of the 3 fights we had, the messer fencers ended up surviving.
Okay.
Yeah, which is really interesting. You'd think that the guy who's trying to murder everybody with a spear would
Yeah, I
have
think
the
that have
advantage,
the easier time, yeah.
but actually, yeah. But
Alright.
once you learn how to work against somebody whose intention is to kill you and they're using a spear, then you can adapt you can adapt your play. You can use specific messer plays to get inside the measure of the spear, and then you can deal with them accordingly. And so, yeah, it was a really interesting experiment, and I love playing with it. Just fencing people for the sake of smashing them around the head after 30 years is pretty boring.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I like the idea of, you get 10 of your students and you've got 3 of them walking through an imaginary woods. And in your fencing hall, for the trees, you put chairs so they can't go where the chairs are. They can use a chair to shield themselves. And then you have 10 students. You have 3 of them walking through the woods. So you create a path through the chairs. And then you have 7 bandits. How do you deal with this? This is fun. This is fun. This is the kind of thing I encourage in HEBA, because this is fun. But it also gives you an insight into kind of not just real life situations. Would it work on the streets? I'm not interested in would it work on the streets. I'm never going to use it on the streets. I'm not going to routinely walk down the street with my sharp 400-gram messer wanting to lop somebody's arm off with it. But playing in the context of history, how would this work out? You're outnumbered in the woods. You and your pal going home drunk from the village fair, and all of a sudden, the guy whose girl you danced with at the village fair has gathered his friends, and they're going to beat the shit out of you with big wooden sticks. And you've got your messer. Yeah. And so make it fun. And if it's not, the one thing I've learned from running the school for the last 20 years is if it's not fun, students pretty soon begin to find other places that are more fun. So make it fun. Make it fun. It doesn't have to be dry. And we've gone through quite a bit of heavy history here. We've done a bit of a deep dive. But that deep dive, there's a lot of groundwork. You've got to read a lot of material. Once you've got that knowledge, you can have fun with it.
I mean, it helps that most of this material is so incredibly interesting.
Yeah, that's where you can have fun with it. But you'll find examples of this in my book. I'm not going to plug my book. If you want to read my, if you'd like to read my book, please read my book. If you like my book, please review my book. If you hate my book, please tell me you hate my book. But give me constructive criticism as to why you hate my book. Not that you're just some English guy with a really weird mixed parentage, pretending to know about medieval swordsmanship. But yeah, that's all good. So it can be a lot of fun. It can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely is. So Bob, I believe we had a time limit today, and we are slightly over the hour.
So I'm gonna have to. Yeah, I'm at the vineyard. And the guys I came with very kindly agreed to let me go away. And the owner of the vineyard, and this is Walker Road Vineyards in Connecticut. They do an astonishing red wine here. It's awesome. If you're in Connecticut, please visit the Walker Road Vineyard. It's wonderful. Big shout out to my brother from another mother, Christian Tobler, who's waiting upstairs for me. To Robin Morris, who organized this trip. Carl, massive thanks for having me on your podcast. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, it's always fun to hang around with you.
I'm sure we're going to be meeting in person at some point soon. And all your listeners and all your viewers, keep having fun. If it's not fun, do something else. But make sure that what you do is not illegal. You can have fun, and it can be, not illegal. Don't stab anybody.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for hanging out, and have a great week. Bye.
I salute you. Bye bye.